On January 12, 2019, a tragedy shattered Alice Peterson's world. The fire started in the early afternoon, while she was at school. By the time neighbors noticed smoke pouring from the windows of the Peterson home, it was already too late. Firefighters arrived to find the house engulfed in flames. Her parents were trapped inside, and the blaze spread too quickly for them to escape. When Alice stepped off the school bus that evening, she saw the blackened remains of her childhood home. She froze, the reality sinking in as firefighters and neighbors milled around in somber silence. The fire chief approached her gently, but his words were a blur. Faulty wiring. Rapid spread. Nothing anyone could do. Alice's legs gave out beneath her, and she might have collapsed entirely if her older brother, Michael, hadn't caught her. "I've got you," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he pulled her into his arms. The smell of smoke clung to his coat, a bitter reminder of what had been lost. The next morning, on January 13, Michael brought Alice to his home on the outskirts of Cincinnati. His wife, Jessica, greeted them at the door with a warm smile. She wrapped Alice in a tight hug, her voice soft and reassuring. "You're safe here now," she said. "We'll take care of you." Alice's new room was small but cozy. Jessica had clearly tried to make it welcoming, with lavender-scented sheets and a teddy bear sitting on the neatly made bed. Alice sat on the edge of the mattress, staring blankly at the unfamiliar walls. It didn't feel like home, but she was too exhausted to care. In the days that followed, Alice tried to adjust to her new life. On January 20, Michael took her to retrieve the few belongings that had survived the fire, a photo album, her mother's locket, and her father's old leather wallet. She held on to them as though they were lifelines, small pieces of the family she had lost. Jessica was attentive at first, cooking Alice's favorite meals and encouraging her to talk about her feelings. But as the weeks passed, her warmth began to fade. On February 8, Alice overheard Michael and Jessica arguing late at night. She had just returned from the library, where she had been staying late to avoid going home. As she climbed the stairs, their voices drifted from the kitchen. "She's grieving, Jess," Michael said. "You can't expect her to be perfect right now." "I'm not asking for perfection," Jessica replied, her voice tense. "But this isn't easy for me either. Our lives have been turned upside down. She's your sister, not mine." The words cut through Alice like a knife. She had suspected she was a burden, but hearing it aloud made her chest ache. She tiptoed back to her room, determined to stay out of their way as much as possible. On February 15, 2019, Jessica appeared in Alice's doorway, her expression neutral. "Dinner's ready," she said. "And don't forget to fold the laundry after." Alice nodded without looking up from her sketchbook. She had been drawing a picture of her old house, whole and untouched by flames. Jessica lingered for a moment before adding, "You know, we've done a lot for you, Alice. I just hope you're grateful." The words hung in the air long after Jessica left. Alice stared down at her drawing, tears blurring the lines. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make this house, or her new life, feel like home. By late March 2019, the tension in the Peterson household had grown unbearable. Jessica's demeanor toward Alice had shifted in ways that Alice couldn't fully understand at first. What had started as strict rules and invasive control began to feel oddly personal. Jessica's watchful gaze lingered too long, her once sharp reprimands softening into unsettling remarks. On March 23, 2019, Alice was doing her homework at the dining table when Jessica walked in. Jessica leaned against the counter, watching her in silence before speaking. "You've grown so much these past few months," Jessica said, her tone unexpectedly warm. "You're not a little girl anymore." Alice looked up, unsure how to respond. Thanks." Jessica smiled, but there was something in her eyes that made Alice's stomach twist. Over the following days, Jessica's behavior became increasingly strange. On March 27, 2019, she knocked on Alice's bedroom door late at night. "Can I come in?" Jessica asked softly. Alice hesitated but nodded, sitting up in bed. Jessica entered and sat down on the edge of the mattress, closer than Alice was comfortable with. "I know things have been hard for you," Jessica began, her voice low. "But I want you to know you're not alone. I care about you, Alice. More than you realize." Alice felt her chest tighten. "Thank you," she said cautiously. Jessica reached out and placed a hand on Alice's knee, her touch lingering. "You're special to me," she said, her eyes locking onto Alice's. The room seemed to close in around Alice. She pulled away, her voice shaky. I think I should go to bed now." Jessica's expression flickered, but she stood and left without another word. Alice stayed awake long after, her heart pounding as she replayed the interaction in her mind. On March 30, 2019, Jessica cornered Alice in the kitchen while Michael was at work. "I need to talk to you," Jessica said, her voice soft but insistent. Alice froze, her hands gripping the counter. "What is it?" Jessica stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "I don't think Michael understands how important you are to me," she said. "We don't have to tell him everything, you know. Some things can just be between us." Alice stared at her, horrified. "What are you talking about?" Jessica reached for her hand, but Alice pulled back. Jessica's face hardened. "Don't act like you don't feel it too," she said, her tone colder now. "I've seen the way you look at me. Come on, you'll be a good girl and do everything I tell you, or you'll lose everything you have now," began to manipulate Jessica. The meetings became more and more frequent. Jessica liked that Michael was almost always away from home, so she used the time alone with Alice to her advantage, forcing the girl to be close. Always cheerful Alice now closed in on herself. She kept all her experiences inside, because she was afraid of losing her brother and family. Until that very day came. On the morning of July 20, 2019, Alice sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her untouched bowl of cereal. Jessica moved around the room, humming softly to herself as though nothing was wrong. Michael was going to work, and before leaving, he kissed Jessica. Alice barely looked up from her seat as he waved goodbye. "I'll see you both tonight," Michael said warmly, his gaze lingering on Alice. "We'll do something fun this weekend, okay?" Alice managed a small nod, but the emptiness in her eyes didn't escape Michael's notice. He hesitated, as though he wanted to say more, but Jessica quickly ushered him out the door. As the hours passed, Jessica continued her usual routine, ignoring Alice for the most part. By midday, Alice retreated to her bedroom, shutting the door quietly behind her. She sat on the edge of her bed, her mind racing. She couldn't live like this anymore. The thought looped endlessly in her head. The weight of her parents' deaths, the isolation, and Jessica's unrelenting control had pushed her to a breaking point. Alice picked up a piece of paper from her desk and began to write. She wrote a note to Michael saying, "Brother, I will always love you." When she finished, she placed the note on her desk, smoothing it out carefully. Then she took a deep breath, her decision made. Michael arrived home that evening around 6 p.m., exhausted from a long day at work. The house was eerily quiet. "Jess? Alice?" he called out, setting his keys on the counter. Jessica appeared from the living room, her expression calm but slightly distracted. "Alice is in her room," she said. "She's been sulking all day. You know how she gets." Michael frowned. "She seemed off this morning. I'll go check on her." Jessica hesitated, but she nodded. "Go ahead. I'll get dinner started." As Michael climbed the stairs, a sense of unease settled over him. He knocked softly on Alice's door. "Alice? It's me. Can I come in?" There was no response. "Alice," he said again, louder this time. When there was still no answer, he pushed the door open, and froze. Alice was there, hanging from the beam above her bed, her lifeless body swaying gently. The world seemed to tilt beneath Michael's feet. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then a guttural scream tore from his throat as he rushed to her, his hands fumbling to untie the makeshift noose. He cradled her in his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "Alice, no," he whispered over and over, his voice broken. "Please, no." Jessica appeared in the doorway moments later, her hand flying to her mouth in feigned shock. "Oh my God," she gasped. "Michael, what happened?" "She's gone," Michael choked out, his voice trembling. "She's gone, Jess. I didn't see it, I didn't know she was hurting this much." Jessica knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's not your fault," she said softly, her tone laced with practiced sorrow. "She was struggling ever since the fire. She never really recovered from losing your parents." Michael clung to her words, desperate for some kind of explanation, but deep down, guilt gnawed at him. "I should have done more," Michael said, his voice cracking. "I should have been there for her." Jessica tightened her grip on his shoulder, her expression carefully composed. "You did everything you could, Michael. She just couldn't cope. It's not your fault." Michael had spent the past days drowning in grief and guilt, replaying every moment with his sister, every sign he had missed. He wasn't prepared for the news that awaited him. The call from the coroner's office came on July 23, 2019, shattering the uneasy silence that had enveloped the Peterson home since Alice's death. "Mr. Peterson," the coroner began, their voice clinical but sympathetic, "the autopsy revealed evidence of sexual assault. It's likely the abuse occurred over a period of months." Michael felt the air leave his lungs. "What?" he whispered, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "We've reported our findings to the police," the coroner continued. "They'll be opening a formal investigation. I'm very sorry for your loss." Michael's hand trembled as he ended the call. He sank into a chair, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a tragedy anymore, it was something far darker. That same afternoon, 2 detectives arrived to begin their investigation. Michael, though devastated, welcomed them into the house, determined to do whatever he could to find answers. The detectives wasted no time. "Mr. Peterson, we'll need to ask you some questions about Alice and her behavior in the months leading up to her death," one of them said. "We're also going to need to speak with your wife." Michael nodded, his grief clouded by confusion. "Of course. Anything you need." The questioning began with Michael. "Mr. Peterson," one of them asked, "did you ever notice anything unusual about Alice's behavior? Did she seem withdrawn, fearful, or uncomfortable around anyone in particular?" Michael ran a hand through his hair, his voice heavy with regret. "She was withdrawn, yes. She changed a lot after the fire. I thought it was grief. I thought," he trailed off, his voice breaking. "I thought she just needed time." The detectives exchanged a glance. "Did Alice ever confide in you about anything? Any concerns, fears, or uncomfortable situations?" Michael shook his head. "No. She never said anything. I would have done something if she had." The questions became more pointed, and Michael's grief turned to indignation as he realized what they were implying. "You think I had something to do with this?" he asked, his voice rising. "We have to consider all possibilities, Mr. Peterson," the detective replied evenly. "The evidence suggests the abuse occurred within the household. We're not ruling anyone out." Michael's face paled. "I would never hurt Alice," he said firmly. The detectives didn't respond, but their silence was louder than words. Jessica's questioning was next, and her responses were markedly different. "I tried so hard with Alice," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "But she just wouldn't open up to me. She was so closed off after the fire." The detectives pressed her on her relationship with Alice, and Jessica's demeanor shifted slightly. I don't know what more I could have done, she said defensively. I was patient, I was supportive. But she wasn't my daughter. I did my best. As the investigation progressed, detectives began speaking to neighbors, classmates, and teachers, piecing together a clearer picture of Alice's life. Mrs. Carver, Alice's art teacher, described her as a bright and creative student who had grown uncharacteristically reserved in the months after moving in with her brother and sister-in-law. She stopped staying after class to work on her sketches, Mrs. Carver said. She started avoiding eye contact, and she never smiled anymore. I wish I had asked more questions. Alice's classmates noticed similar changes. She just stopped being herself, one girl said. She was always nervous, like she thought someone was watching her. I tried to talk to her, but she said she couldn't explain. The detectives also interviewed neighbors, several of whom mentioned seeing Alice in the backyard with Jessica on multiple occasions. She was always hovering around that girl, one neighbor said. At first, I thought she was just being protective, but sometimes it seemed odd. Like she was too close. Another neighbor added, I saw them arguing a few times. Jessica would grab her arm or get in her face. It didn't look like a normal thing. One neighbor recalled a particularly unsettling interaction. Jessica was holding Alice by the shoulders, talking to her quietly but forcefully, the neighbor said. Alice looked terrified. I thought about saying something, but I didn't want to get involved. On August 15, 2019, Michael's morning started like any other, though the weight of Alice's death lingered in every corner of the house. He had been trying to resume some semblance of normalcy, but grief clung to him, a constant shadow. That day, as he prepared to leave for work, a minor inconvenience disrupted his routine. His phone's camera refused to work. Great, he muttered, fiddling with the settings to no avail. He had checks to deposit for his office and needed a working camera. Jess, he called, walking into the kitchen. Jessica was sitting on the living room couch, sipping her coffee. What is it? She asked curtly. My phone's camera isn't working. Can I borrow yours to take a picture of these checks? Jessica hesitated for a moment, gripping her mug tighter. Sure, she finally said, reaching for her phone. She handed it over with a forced smile. Michael barely registered her words, focused on his task. Sitting at the dining table, Michael opened the camera app on Jessica's phone. As he scrolled through her gallery to ensure there was enough storage, a folder caught his attention. It was tucked away among other apps, labeled Utilities, an odd name for what appeared to be a media folder. Curious, Michael tapped it open. What he found made his breath catch. Inside were several videos, each labeled with a date. The earliest was from March, the most recent from June. His heart pounded as he selected the first video, and the screen filled with a dimly lit recording of Alice sitting on her bed, her posture stiff and her face etched with fear. Jessica's voice was clear, though Michael wished he couldn't hear it. You're nothing without us, Jessica said coldly in the video. You'll end up in an orphanage if you don't start behaving. Michael's stomach churned as he played another video, then another. Each one documented Jessica's escalating abuse, verbal, emotional, and physical. The most recent videos were the most harrowing, showing a broken, silent Alice enduring Jessica's cruelty without resistance. Michael dropped the phone onto the table, his hands trembling. The horrific truth was undeniable. Jessica had betrayed him, and she had destroyed Alice. Michael stormed into the living room. Jessica, he shouted, his voice shaking with anger. Jessica turned, startled. What's wrong? She asked, her voice laced with feigned concern. Michael held up her phone. What the hell is this? Jessica's face paled. What are you talking about? Michael's rage boiled over. The videos, Jessica. The ones of Alice. I saw them. I know what you did. Jessica took a step back, shaking her head. I don't know what you're talking about, she said defensively. You must be mistaken. Don't lie to me. Michael roared, throwing the phone onto the coffee table. I watched them. All of them. How could you do this to her? She trusted you. I trusted you. Jessica opened her mouth to protest but faltered under Michael's furious glare. Her composure cracked, and tears began to well in her eyes. I didn't mean for it to get this far, she whispered, her voice trembling. Michael stared at her in disbelief. Get this far? You destroyed her, Jessica. She was a child. She was already dealing with so much, and you, his voice broke. You broke her. Jessica sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I didn't know how to handle her, she said, her words muffled. She was so difficult. She wouldn't listen to me, and she looked up, tears streaming down her face. I lost control. Michael's anger burned hotter. Lost control. This wasn't a moment of weakness, Jessica. This was months of torment. You recorded it. You knew exactly what you were doing. Jessica sobbed openly now. I'm sorry, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't mean to hurt her like that. I didn't know what else to do. Michael's fists clenched. You destroyed her, he said, his voice shaking with fury. You tortured her, humiliated her, broke her spirit. She ended her life because of you. Jessica sighed and crossed her arms. You're being dramatic. Alice was unstable long before she came here. I tried to help her, but she was impossible. Don't you dare try to justify what you did, he growled, his voice rising. Jessica smirked, a flicker of arrogance in her eyes. You didn't even notice, Michael. You were too busy with work, too busy pretending to be the good brother while I dealt with her tantrums. This isn't on me, it's on you. Those words were the final straw. Michael lunged at Jessica, his grief and rage exploding in a way he could no longer control. The kitchen filled with the sounds of a struggle as Michael grabbed Jessica by the shoulders and shoved her against the wall. She clawed at his arms, her screams echoing through the house, but Michael was unrelenting. You took everything from her, he shouted, his voice raw. And you don't even care. Jessica's protests turned into gasps as Michael's hands moved to her throat. You destroyed her life, he said through gritted teeth. Now you'll know what it feels like. Her struggles grew weaker as her breaths became shallow. Michael released her suddenly, letting her crumple to the floor, coughing and gasping for air. Jessica looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear for the first time. You're insane, she croaked. Michael didn't respond. He grabbed a length of rope from the garage and dragged Jessica, still dazed and struggling to catch her breath, up the stairs to Alice's room. In the dim light of the room, Michael tied the rope securely to the beam above Alice's bed. Jessica began to panic, thrashing and pleading. Michael, please, she sobbed. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean any of it. Michael ignored her, his face a mask of cold determination. You don't get to apologize, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. You don't get to make this right. You took her life, and now I'm taking yours. Jessica's cries grew louder as Michael tightened the noose around her neck. Please, Michael, don't do this. But Michael had already made up his mind. He hoisted her off the ground, her screams cutting off abruptly as the rope tightened. He stepped back, watching as Jessica's struggles slowed, then ceased altogether. The room fell silent once more, save for the creaking of the rope. Michael sat on Alice's bed, his chest heaving, his mind racing with the enormity of what he had done. He looked around the room, at the drawings on the walls, the books stacked neatly on the desk, the faint remnants of Alice's presence. Michael knew he was to blame, so without hesitation he called the police, reporting what had happened. The police responded quickly. Mikhailu did not resist when the police accused him of murder. He confessed everything, his voice hollow and devoid of emotion. "She killed Alice," he said simply. "I just evened the score." During Michael's trial, the court was presented with the videos documenting Jessica's abuse of Alice. The footage shocked everyone present, painting a grim picture of the torment Alice had endured. Michael's defense argued that his actions were the result of overwhelming grief and emotional trauma. "He's a man broken by the loss of his sister," his lawyer said. "He acted out of pain, not malice." The prosecution, however, focused on the premeditated nature of Jessica's murder. "Vigilante justice is no justice at all," the prosecutor said. No matter how heinous Jessica's actions were, Michael Peterson took the law into his own hands. On January 20, 2020, Michael was sentenced to 25 years in prison for second-degree murder. As he was led away, he turned to the courtroom, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and defiance. "I did what I had to do," he said quietly.